Hello, everybody. I'm Eli Lake, here on Blogging Heads today with Peter Beinart, the author of The Icarus Syndrome and a recent essay in the New York Review of Books on the state of liberal Zionism. Peter, thanks for doing this. I should say we did record something on Friday, but for technical reasons, we don't have it. So this is our second attempt at this discussion.
That's right. It was sabotaged by either AIPAC, J Street, or Hamas.
There you go. All right, so why don't you start off, Peter? Summarize the argument in the essay.
Sure. So the argument in the essay is that among younger secular Jews, connection to Israel is in dramatic decline, and that one of the reasons is that those Jews have liberal values that are not consistent with the leadership of the organized American Jewish community's decision to not publicly criticize Israel, particularly this Israeli government, which I argue has very strongly kind of illiberal and authoritarian leanings.
Illiberal and authoritarian leanings.
Yeah.
All right, you want to expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, you have Avigdor Lieberman as deputy prime minister and foreign minister who has a background in Kach, Meir Kahane's racist party, which explicitly supported physical expulsion of the Palestinians, and Lieberman has made a big part of his political agenda an effort to kind of delegitimize Arab Israelis, accuse them of to just take away some of their rights, accuse them of treason. You have a Shas party which has an extraordinarily kind of illiberal worldview, with its spiritual leader Ovadia Yosef having called Palestinians ants and snakes, and calling for Ariel Sharon to be struck down by God after he withdrew settlements from Gaza. And you have Benjamin Netanyahu, who has a lifelong, and I think unchanged, deep hostility to the idea of a Palestinian state. So I think, all in all, I think and has led a kind of an attempt at real crackdown against Israeli human rights organizations. So I think it's a really illiberal, authoritarian kind of government.
Crackdown against human rights organizations?
Yeah, I mean, the effort to kind of change the tax status, the campaign against the New Israel Fund to make it basically harder for Israeli human rights organizations to get support from abroad. I think that's part of an effort, basically, to try to respond not only to the criticism that the Israeli government has gotten from international human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, but very much, I think they feel even more threatened in many ways by groups like Breaking the Silence, which come from within Israel itself and indeed among former Israeli soldiers.
Well, I mean that's a wild card. I don't remember that in your essay, and I have to say I'm not entirely up to speed on that. But I want to get back to Bibi Netanyahu. I'm really. Why do you think a 1993 campaign book is a better indication of Netanyahu's views than the public speeches he's given as prime minister in the late 1990s and currently, or for that matter, agreeing to the temporary settlement freeze, including natural growth, or any number of other things? I mean, Peter, you of all people know what it's like to change your mind. I mean, you.
Sure,
I mean,
sure. Go ahead, Phil. I don't want to interrupt you. Go ahead, finish.
Well, no. I'm just saying. I think that the view of Netanyahu in particular, it doesn't even account for. I mean, it's another weakness in the essay. I think is that you capture one side of a kind of paradox right now about Israeli politics, which is that, it's true that the current coalition in Israeli government is probably as far to the right as, we know of, at least since the era of the peace process. To give a sense of that, Meretz and Labor in 1992 have nearly half the votes in the Knesset. Meretz and Labor today have 16 votes in the Knesset. And so there is a sense that Israeli public has moved to the right, but the right has moved closer to the center in that after Sharon, you have an understanding and a kind of acknowledgement or an acceptance that the project of Eretz Yisrael, that you would fill the West Bank and you would make up for the demographic problem by, the influx of immigrants from the former Soviet Union and later an influx of immigrants from other areas, which was the sort of founding idea of the entire settler movement, is no longer has any currency in the center, and the settlers are more vulnerable today than they were 10 years ago. So, I mean, I guess I'd say, it's just, I don't understand why you wouldn't include all of that recent history So it came off as a very one-sided history of Israeli politics and kind of bereft of context.
All right. Well, there's a lot there. So let me try to go through some of it. Yes, of course, people can change their mind. Benjamin Netanyahu, as you know, is spent his whole life essentially deeply steeped in the revisionist tradition. His father was an aide to Zev Jabotinsky, and if he had made a real intellectual moral break, as others have, like Tzipi Livni, Yitzhak Rabin, I would be the first to stand up and cheer. Sadly, I see no evidence for that whatsoever. I mean, let's go and look at his recent behavior. In the 2009 campaign, he ran against the idea of a Palestinian state. He still remained opposed to a Palestinian state when forming his government, which was very important because had he been willing to break and say he supported one, I think it would have been easier to get Tzipi Livni and Kadima into his coalition and not have such a right-wing coalition. Then, under intense pressure from the Obama administration, he came out, he gave this speech at Bar-Ilan University where he did utter the words Palestinian state. But if you look at the commentary of Israelis who genuinely are for a Palestinian state, if you look at what Tzipi Livni said about it, which we said basically was a sham, or you look at Ben Caspit of Mariv, who said basically these were, one of Israel's 2 or 3 most prominent columnists, who said basically these were poison pills that Netanyahu injected precisely because he knew it would make it impossible for the Palestinians to actually act in response. I mean, there are 2 poison pills in particular. The first is the demand that the Palestinians not just accept Israel, but accept Israel as a Jewish state. Totally unnecessary, I think, and something that would be very, very difficult, if not impossible for them to do, given that most Arab Israelis, and for somewhat understandable reasons, even though they feel Israeli, would in fact rather Israel not be a Jewish state since they're not Jews. Secondly, his claim that Jerusalem has to remain united under Israeli sovereignty, which actually flies in the face of the kind of deal that Barak offered, that any reasonable person would have to accept as the only kind of deal you're going to get, which is some Palestinian sovereignty over East Jerusalem. So I can go and I can talk about this. We can talk about the settlement freeze too, which I think is absolutely a sham. We can talk about Sharon if you want to talk about Sharon, but I don't want to keep these. I don't want to keep these answers, make these answers too long. So why don't I just stop on that point about?
Well, let me respond. Let me respond to that. In the Likud primary in 2000, Ariel Sharon ran against Netanyahu because he said Netanyahu had accepted, and his prior government had accepted, a 2-state solution. And Netanyahu, before he becomes prime minister in 1998, argues that Likud is sort of accepting the notion of the peace process and a 2-state solution, but he stresses the notion of reciprocity. And under Netanyahu's first premiership, he signs the Y River Accord, which of course envisions a 2-state solution.
Well,
so Peter, wait a second. Let's get real here, okay? Israeli prime ministers say certain things when they're running for office. Israeli prime ministers say one thing, and when they govern, they say something else. And for you to sort of take a very tendentious view that Netanyahu really doesn't mean it this time, but he means it this time, and you only like the politicians that you like is picking and choosing. You can't pick the facts
Eli.
On this,
the problem is, for the sake of this conversation, I think you have to be a little bit briefer, so I have a chance actually to respond to the points. Okay, I don't want to interrupt you, but let me respond to the points. Okay, let's look at what Netanyahu has actually done. Right? I mean, he refused to implement Oslo. He demanded that Oslo be renegotiated after he was elected in 1996. As Dennis Ross, who writes extensively about the whole Netanyahu prime ministership in his book, and I think you would agree, is not a left-wing extremist, basically says that everybody in the Clinton administration, Berger, Albright, Clinton himself, believed that Netanyahu had no interest whatsoever in negotiating a Palestinian state. Netanyahu did finally sign the Y River, which was a significant kind of, in many ways, kind of pullback from what Oslo was supposed to do in terms of the second withdrawal of territory. But then let's look what he did there. He made no serious effort, really, to get it through his own government. In some ways, it's quite analogous to the situation today. The only way he was really going to get Y implemented would have been to shift his coalition away from a far-right coalition and make it a more centrist one. He refused to do that. He stalled in even bringing to the cabinet. He allowed the cabinet to instead of voting it for once in support of it, to have to vote repeatedly on every different separate measure, which made it much more difficult that it was going to get it through. And then his government collapsed. So I really see, if you're telling me that under extreme pressure, Bibi Netanyahu will take tactical kind of maneuvers to try to keep the Americans off his back, that's true. But in terms of doing anything serious that would actually move towards bringing towards a Palestinian state, I don't see it at all.
First of all, if you're arguing in this sort of hypothetical, would Bibi at this moment negotiate a peace agreement? Who knows? The Palestinians are deeply divided politically right now, and I think that Bibi, like almost every other Israeli, doesn't think that there is an immediate chance that you're going to have a final status negotiation. One piece of evidence for that is that the Palestinians have backed off on their longstanding policy of direct talks with the Israeli government and are now demanding proximity talks. So these are gambits. And as for your other point about the poison pill of recognizing it as a Jewish state, it's a negotiating gambit. That was Tzipi Livni's position at the beginning of the Annapolis negotiations process. And for you to say to think it's a sort of poison pill that forecloses any option, I don't think you understand the difference between when you actually have a negotiation and that you make kind of concessions and you build up positions. There's a whole art to this. And then like your contention that somehow Bibi is committed to a politics of a greater Israel, which is just not true. There is no center constituency in Israel. There is no one in the national security establishment in Israel. And there's really no one in the Likud party right now, at least in the leadership of Israel, that wants or believes that they're going to continue this dream that started in the late 1970s with the original Likud government of Menachem Begin, and probably you'd have to say ended in 2005 when Arik Sharon unilaterally withdrew and we dismantled these settlements.
Eli, I really wish that were true. In reality, what we've seen is the number of settlers on the West Bank has gone from 200 to 300,000, with another 200,000 in East Jerusalem. And if Benjamin Netanyahu were in fact so committed to the idea of a Palestinian state ever, then you explain to me why, in fact, he publicly refused to take that position while he ran for prime minister and when he was negotiating a government, and only did it under enormous pressure from Barack Obama, and then in a very, very, very backhanded way in that Bar-Ilan speech.
Listen, I don't think, first of all, I don't think it's necessarily backhanded. Second of all, Bibi Netanyahu, and as we talked about, we can go round and round on this, but Israeli politics have changed. It's changed in the following sense. On the one hand, you're correct. Israelis are very doubtful that the Palestinians are going to be viable partners for peace. So you saw a lot of politicians, including Ehud Barak, running and positioning themselves as very differently than they did in the heyday of the peace process in the 1990s. On the other hand, Israelis accept there is no way that they can indefinitely occupy a demographic majority of Palestinians. And finally, I want to talk about your contention about 200 to 300,000 settlers, because I think it's a bit misleading. One of the things that I don't think you acknowledge in your essay is that there is a huge difference between the kinds of settlement activities that we saw up and through the 90s, which was creating new settlements, having a policy of punishing Palestinians by destroying their homes, destroying new Palestinian homes for the expansion of the perimeter of these settlements. And then what you're seeing now, which is there is a marketplace in the settlements known as Ma'ale Adumim, the Jerusalem metropolitan area, where, yes, that is widely accepted in the Taba agreements. It's going to remain in Israel. It's Jewish majority area. Some of these neighborhoods go back before 1967, before 1948. They were Jewish neighborhoods, and then the demography was changed between 48 and 1967. And these kinds of territories are not the same